Where are we headed?
We're going to Camp Porcelain Peak.
Oh, yeah. Planning on smoking a little dope, having a little premarital sex, and getting slaughtered?
Here are your totally rad camp counselors, Tone, John, and Anthony.
Thank you, camp version of Constance. Welcome, everyone, to your all-time favorite spooky, scary summer camp, Camp Porcelain Peak.
We're so excited to be here.
My God, my parents didn't make me come here for the whole summer or anything. I didn't wish I was at home playing PS4.
Yeah, so glad to see the energy level is really high today.
Yeah, we're bringing it.
As always, I am joined by my lovely co-hosts, Counselor Tone and Counselor John. How are you guys doing today?
I'm doing pretty good, a little hot. Weather took an upturn, but I'm ready to talk about some children's horror or horror for children or horror aimed at children, whatever the fuck we're calling it.
I don't think you should be talking about aiming at children.
Whichever one of those gets us in the least trouble.
Something I've been wanting to talk about for a long time. I think even in season 1 we talked about it. So.
We've been sneaking into talking about this topic by doing Tales from the Crypt because it scared me, doing Are You Afraid of the Dark because it scared some other, and I'm
when we did Goosebumps during our Terror Tales. I mean, it's been a long time coming.
We've been edging around this topic.
How are you doing this week, John? Counselor John.
Ooh, Counselor John. It sounds like you're talking to a lawyer. My mom wishes. Yeah, so I'm doing pretty good. Today is one of my, because now I'm working at the store, and I'm also working from home part of the time. So today was one of my work from home days, and then I have the next 2 days off. Pretty excited about that. And it's just been a lot of fun kind of doing research. And then obviously, if any of you listened to last week's episode, I'm just balls deep in Mr. Robot right now. So my mind is completely fried, but I'm here.
Well, who better to be balls deep in than Christian Slater?
How are you doing, Counselor Anthony?
I'm doing great. I totally agree with you. It is too hot, and I'm already sweating and super excited that we have to be on camera in a little bit. But outside of that, all of my focus between last week and this week has been the social media, and boy, is it awesome. Everybody who has been interacting with us and having conversations with us and arguing with us about which Friday the 13th movies are the best. I appreciate all of that. I can say that within a week, I feel like it feels like our audience is twice as big, even if it physically isn't. It feels like it is just from the amount of interaction. So I really just encourage people to keep doing that, because outside of actually doing the recording of this podcast, that's the most fun I have. And it's what keeps me motivated and inspired to continue doing it is all of the conversation and the fun community, which is something that I'll talk a bit more about a little bit later on. But yeah, I'm pretty happy with how things are going.
Yeah, so everybody that has been interacting with us a lot on there, messaging us or interested in joining us for an episode, we just want to say thank you to everybody that's been participating. It's been really fun talking to different people about different stuff. I mean, I talked to somebody about Medieval Dead that came up on trivia.
I think we've had a couple of different people we've talked about Medieval Dead too.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good trivia. Bit of trivia.
We've been talking a lot about Train to Busan with people.
Yeah, there's a lot of hype around that sequel. Yeah.
A little bit about Scream. I mean, we've been having a lot of fun discussions, and it hasn't just been on our stuff. We've been kind of seeking out some of those fun discussions in our Instagram feed, on Twitter.
Yeah, so again, thanks everyone for giving us some love.
Yeah, we hope to hear more for sure. So today, as teased a little bit by Counselor Tone, we are going to be talking about childhood horror. So this is going to be that horror that is obviously geared toward children and either had an effect on us or has had an effect on people we know that are either horror fans or not horror fans. I feel like it swings wildly in both directions depending on how absolutely traumatized you were by things. So yeah, that's going to be a really fun discussion. We've been putting it off for much too long, but before we get to it, we're going to make you wait a little bit longer and get into some news. And something really important that we wanted to stress about this episode is this is not an episode that is suitable for children. I mean, that is not a surprise if you listen to any of our previous episodes. There is some language and some lewd humor. But because of the childhood part of this episode, we want to make sure that your kids aren't accidentally listening to us curse like sailors and talk about creepy things. So just parental discretion is advised.
You see, Jason was my son, and today is his birthday.
Although Ashley, the intern, did provide us with a plethora of news this week, I came across something that I thought was...
Oh, you had something spicy.
Spicy. Yeah. So it's science fiction, but becoming science fact.
Oh, shit.
Which is crazy. So they are making a contact lens like they did in Black Mirror.
I saw this on Mac Rumors the other day.
Yeah. So this thing is a computer inside your contact lens that allows you to record videos, surf the web, has facial and object recognition, and takes photos. So, I mean, we're fucking living in the future. And it's like, dude, it's Black Mirror. They warned you against the problems with this. Why do it? But they're like, that's a good idea. We should do that. Next thing you know, we're going to have killer robot bees.
Doesn't it actually use the image from that Black Mirror episode with the dude with his eyes all whited out, the guy from Servant?
One of the videos I watched had clips of Black Mirror in it, in between clips of the actual thing explaining how it worked. And I was like, well, I mean,
maybe don't use the scary show to advertise your product that physically goes into somebody's eyeball. As a contact wearer, this is something that I would be totally on board with. The only thing that I could see as maybe a problem, especially like coming from someone who has experience with VR and how straining that can be on your eyes, having screens that close, having anything moving like that close to your eyes, I feel like you're not going to be able to wear it for an extended period of time. So the convenience factor is a little bit, I'd have to look at more into that and see if this is going to be like an all-day wear, because that's where I would see that being interesting. Since I was a kid, thought if I could just blink my eyes and take a picture of what I'm seeing, like in the moment, that would be so awesome. And then think of the applications for, obviously, like just the safety of, like public safety and things like that. People being able to video and take photos. And obviously privacy issues come up. So it's going to be a really interesting, potentially frightening development, but...
One of the things they talked about doing with it is VR.
Yeah.
So that might be shorter term. I just think it's wild to see something that we saw years ago, whenever the first season of Black Mirror was, which we were like, whoa, that's crazy. And now it's happening.
That's just a testament to how, at least at one point, that show was really on the cutting edge of all of that stuff. That's just good sci-fi. If it starts to come true and makes you a little bit scared, then it's good sci-fi.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I was picturing walking around with like a full-blown like video game HUD, heads-up display, just being like, all right, I'm looking around. I've got like the things I have in my backpack listed on the right, and instructions on what to do next.
Well, I feel like what it's going to look like is when we see Iron Man's perspective while he's in the helmet.
Yeah.
Like we get these screens kind of around you, and so I'm assuming that's going to be similar to that. But anyway, that's what I had this week. John, what about you?
I have some things that are closer to the media side of stuff. We got confirmation that Mandalorian Season 2 will be coming this October, which I'm excited about. It's similar to our discussion about the Umbrella Academy Season 2. It was something where I didn't know that they had even started principal photography, and the fact that they'd already completed it and are in the process of editing it and are ready to go, it was shocking to me, and I'm glad that it's coming on schedule and that it's not going to be pushed back like everything else because of theater windows and all that stuff. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is that we're getting more and more and more and more information about Ari Aster's next film, which I'm so fucking stoked about. I don't care what it is. He could make a fucking romantic comedy next. I'm going to be there day one seeing that shit.
It's supposed to be a 4-hour nightmare comedy or something, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sold.
Sounds. I mean, it sounds really right up his alley. Like it sounds like exactly the kind of thing that he would do next. And I need to go back and rewatch Midsommar, but I loved that movie when I saw it, and I have been very outspoken about how much I absolutely love Hereditary on this show. So yeah, count me in 110% for whatever that weirdness is.
Yeah, I've seen both of them twice now. Definitely, they both have benefits of watching on more than once. It was Tone that sent us a picture that someone had sent him of like a face in the forest, and I didn't catch that until after I watched it a second time. It's those little tiny details are the things you just gloss over because you're just like, what the fuck am I doing when you're watching it at the theater? and you just pick up on so much more watching them more and more and more. I haven't checked out the director's cut, which is available now, which I do want to check out because obviously, if spoiler alert for a previous episode, it was my favorite horror movie of the last decade. I think that it's definitely worth the watch. I'm really excited for what's happening next.
In the spooky, creepy neck of the woods, literally, we're getting some new Evil Dead, apparently. That is the super big, exciting news that I have been kind of following. First, our little tidbit was that Sam Raimi, who we've talked about before, is now going to be directing the new Doctor Strange movie, if that ever ends up becoming a thing now. He handpicked a new director to helm a new Evil Dead movie, which is something that I didn't think we were actually going to get because we got Ash versus Evil Dead. And it seemed like that was kind of the end of the whole thing. And now Raimi has handpicked Lee Cronin, who is the director of a movie that I recommended on a previous episode called The Hole in the Ground, which is a very good atmospheric, creepy horror movie that I was a big fan of. So this is a really cool choice for me. I think that everything that we're hearing so far is exciting. Bruce Campbell said he is not coming back. He still has retired the character of Ash, but the movie is going to, as of now, be titled Evil Dead Now. Sam said it's going to be more of an expansive look at kind of the Evil Dead world. It's going to take a different direction, and he heavily implied, basically confirmed that it's going to have a female hero, much like the reboot that we already got. So I would be interested how much this connects to any of the other Evil Dead, or if this is going to be another reboot of the series. But the fact that Raimi handpicked a director and Campbell is talking about it means that obviously that it has some sort of blessing from them. So I just love Evil Dead, and I've been really happy with the stuff that we've gotten. I just haven't finished Ash vs. Evil Dead, shamefully. So what do you guys think? You think that's good news, bad news? What?
I can tell you that Anthony hates Evil Dead for sure. He doesn't have the Necronomicon tattooed on his leg or anything.
Why you gotta pick on me, man? Yeah, no, I don't love the name.
Yeah.
I think it's a little bit silly. Like, Evil Dead Now reminds me of Kablam, that old 90s
That's
show.
probably what they're going for. I think it's probably going to change before the movie comes out.
It's probably just working title at this point.
But hey, if they're gonna do sort of like what Halloween wanted to do originally, and just do Evil Dead movies that are different each time, I'm all for it. Give us more of that universe. They don't all need to connect. It doesn't always work.
And the Necronomicon's been around for who knows how long. There's plenty of other stories that you could tell with that whole concept, yeah.
So I'm all for it.
Yeah.
I mean, like we said, Raimi sometimes produces really good things and then really shitty things, so I'm hoping this is his upswing.
Yeah, I agree. I love most of what Sam Raimi does in the director's chair. His production is a little hit and miss. There are some things that I've definitely enjoyed, like last year's Crawl. I enjoyed that. If we can get more in the Evil Dead universe, I'm not going to complain. I'll have a good time. You know, it's just what exactly is more expansive look going to mean, and is it going to get too bloated, or is it going to be something that we'll still get a pointed story from and that we'll be able to enjoy and have a good time with?
Yeah, bring Lucy Lawless in.
Yeah.
Fuck it.
All I got to say that is Klaatu Barada Nikto. So, if you want to see any of that news in more detail, you want to check out those articles, see what I hope by the time you hear this will be a more expansive news section on the Facebook page. Sorry. Then hop on over to our Facebook group. Just search Porcelain Peak. We are basically everywhere on all social media as Porcelain Peak. But for now, let's go ahead and move on to that trivia.
No. Trivia.
Oh my god. I like it less each week.
Yeah.
Stop now.
God, leave us alone.
Then answer the question. Same category.
Oh, please stop.
Name the killer in Friday the 13th.
Jason! Jason!
I'm sorry. That's the wrong answer.
No, it's not. It was Jason.
Afraid not? No way.
All right, we are still doing our Totally 80s Stranger Things trivia. John, I'm going to read to you.
You just trying to ruin it now?
Yeah.
It's your catchphrase. You can't not say in typical fashion.
In typical fashion, you're going to read to Anthony, and then Anthony will read back to me, Counselor Tone. And the first category is movies. Counselor John. What 1982 fantasy movie about a warrior who can communicate with animals did poorly at the box office, but later became a hit on cable TV?
Is it going to be a never-ending story?
It is going to be The Beastmaster.
Yeah,
I knew it.
I did not know that. Counselor Anthony, which Big Bang Theory actress co-starred in the movie Beaches when she was 12 years old?
I'm going to just guess that it was Kaylee Cuoco.
It is Mayim Bialik.
Oh, I didn't-
the doctor.
Yeah, that would have been my other guess because she's the only other one whose name I actually know, but I didn't know she had been around that long
Yeah, I didn't
in the
either.
acting scene.
Yeah, I did not either. I didn't know she'd been around that long. I thought that when Big Bang Theory came out, she just existed.
She was conjured into existence, much like the universe in the Big Bang.
It all ties back together.
Full circle. Counselor Tone, what superhero film that grossed over $400 million features Jack Nicholson wondering, where does he get those wonderful toys?
That's going to be Batman with Michael Keaton and directed by Tim Burton and
All right, overachiever, let's move on to the next question.
soundtrack by Prince.
You're not getting bonus points for all that, but you are correct.
Our next category is TV. Counselor John on the superhero cartoon series Super Friends. What were brother and sister Zan and Jaina also known as?
Is that the Wonder Twins?
That is the one.
Activate.
Twins. They also have a blue alien monkey pet named Gleek. Don't they do the?
Yeah. Wonder Twins activate. Yeah.
Yeah.
Don't they-
Form of, and then they'll turn into like water or whatever.
Yeah.
A cup full of water.
Yeah.
What ability did the Care Bears often use to defeat their enemies, which involved the bears linking hands and blasting light from their tummies?
Well, that's gonna be a motherfucking Care Bear stare.
It is indeed the Care Bear stare.
It's the most vulgar that's ever been. That motherfucking Care Bear stick. Yeet in the hell.
Counselor Tone, what is the name of the actress who played Punky Brewster? Is it Mayim Bialik, Salil Moon Fry, or Nola Reese Diane? Jesus, they're really trying to trip me up. Make me look like an uncultured swine.
I'll say the third one.
Nola Reese Diane?
Yes.
The answer is Salil Moon Fry.
Bitch. Okay.
One.
We're all tied up as we move into the music category. John, what British pop band included Simon Le Bon, Roger Taylor, Andy Taylor, Nick Rhodes, and John Taylor?
I have no idea. Duran Duran?
It is Duran Duran.
Wow.
I've never heard any of their names before. I know their music. Never heard any of
You
their
thought it
names
was
before.
literally two people named Duran.
Duran and Duran.
Or you know Duran Duran? Name all their songs.
The video for what Cyndi Lauper song included a cameo from wrestling legend Captain Lou Albano as her dad?
Is that Girls Just Want to Have Fun?
It is indeed Girls Just Want to Have Fun.
Come on in the morning like my...
Copyright strike.
Counselor Tone, who asked herself, how will I know, only to get so emotional?
I feel like I could kind of hear it. Will I know you really love me? How will I know? What? I don't even know if that's right.
I don't know if that's the right song. That's a song that exists.
That song exists.
Take a wild guess. You could get one of those weird John guesses.
Cyndi Lauper.
It's Whitney Houston.
Okay, we're going to move on to famous people and events. Counselor Jiggity John, which...
It's worse every time.
Jiggity John, which who's the boss at... So you guys can both have things, but I can't have a fucking thing?
Your thing was in typical fashion.
That's the thing? I get the boring thing? In typical fashion on tonight's news.
You don't have to deliver it like that. You just decide to do that.
Which Who's the Boss actress began hosting Project Runway All-Stars in 2013? How will I know if you get this wrong?
You're going to know in a second because I'm going to say Heidi Klum because I have no fucking clue.
Wrong! Alyssa Milano.
All right. I didn't know she was
Charmed motherfucker.
I didn't know she was in that. What 16-year-old American gymnast scored a perfect 10 with her vault to win the all-around gold medal in the 1984 Summer Olympics?
Dude, everybody knows this.
Pamela Valtese.
Dude. Nailed it.
Perfect. All right, now it was Mary Lou Retton, the first American woman to do it.
not familiar with my Olympics before like the year 2010 or something. So
I know.
And even then,
Phelps.
it's just Michael Phelps. And that's it.
exactly.
And Tanya.
Harding.
There you go.
Counselor Tone, what comedian won a Grammy for Best Comedy Recording in 1985 and then went on to also win an Emmy, Oscar, and Tony in her career?
Whoopi Goldberg.
You got it. Whoopi Goldberg, making
Nice.
her a member of the exclusive EGOT Club. Love Whoopi.
Nice,
Love
nice,
me
nice.
some Whoopi.
Was that joke? I have an EGOT. Oh, really? Yeah, I was banned from all the events. We are all tied up as we move into trends, tech, and fun. JD John, what material were friendship bracelets typically made out of? Was it thread, plastic watch bands, or leather?
I'm gonna say thread.
That is correct. They were often hand woven and then given to best buds.
Oh,
I always wanted one as a kid.
You have one now.
I made these for myself.
Well, we didn't know that.
Well then, finish the '80s phrase. Gag me with a.
Is it Rusty Spoon? I know that's a thing you say, so I don't know if that would ever like existed. Gag me with a spoon. Gag me with a. I don't fucking know.
Quit while you're ahead. It's gag me with a spoon. Yeah, rusty.
Okay.
Rusty is something that I added, and I also say gag me with a rusty blade.
So that's fucked up, and also you helped me with this trivia.
I
So
did,
if I
yeah.
win, it's totally your fault, John.
A Johnism got you through.
Yeah,
Imagine that.
I wouldn't have. Tone to tone.
Jocking, dude.
What kind of lipstick changed colors by detecting your skin's pH levels? pH levels. Was it fade, mood, or glow?
Mood.
You are correct. It was mood, like those mood rings. Yeah,
Yeah, what a dumb.
So is it.
classic.
We are still all tied as we move into that Stranger Things category. Counselor John, when Nancy and Steve have dinner with Barb's parents in season 2, they eat takeout from which restaurant?
That is going to be Kentucky Fried Chicken.
Yeah, that's right.
Finger licking. Eat your fingers off.
It's
Good.
it's finger looking good. Counselor Anthony. When Eleven jealously uses her powers on Max because Max is talking to Mike, what does Max fall off of?
That's an easy ass question.
Yeah, it is.
Does she fall off like the RV or whatever? The trailer? I don't know.
She falls off of her skateboard.
In the gym?
Oh yeah, I wouldn't have gotten that in a million years, so I'll take that loss for sure. Tone. 11's sister Callie has what number tattooed on her wrist?
8.
Correct. It's 8.
Nice.
Okie dokie, artichokes. We have a tie, which means we have to go to the tiebreaker Thunderdome Stranger Things question. First person to get this right, as soon as I finish the question,
Thank you
is
for
the winner.
Thank you for the disclaimer.
In season 1, when Dustin and Will race on their bikes, what is the prize for the winner? Done.
A comic book.
X-Men comic book.
Just as a comic book, so I'm going to give it to John. Will wins and gets to choose from any of Dustin's comics. Sounds like it's probably an X-Men comic book, so you get brownie points for the details. Congratulations again. You rehabilitated your public image, and who won last week?
You did.
You
I
did.
did.
You
Okay.
Did. So you broke up my streak, but
Okay, well, you're starting another one, so
yeah, starting a new one.
you know.
At one.
John gets knocked down, then he gets up again. So
Occasionally.
It's a very different song.
Yep.
That's going to wrap it up this week for our trivia segment. If you enjoyed hearing that and are interested in seeing how stupid we look during it, then head over to YouTube and you can watch us sweat this shit out every week.
Literally.
Yes, and if you enjoyed that news, like we mentioned earlier, we have a ton of stuff on news going onto the Facebook group that we don't have time to discuss here. So check that out. There's a ton of stuff. Ashley, the intern, keeps busy, and it's great. We appreciate it so much. And sometimes I'm like, I don't know what the fuck I'm going to say this week. You know what I mean? So check it out because there's a lot of good stuff on there.
So, like we mentioned earlier, we're going to be diving deep into our conversation about horror that is geared toward the younger audience, the children of the world. We are the world, we are the children. And So yeah, I think what we want to do is kind of go into some of the history behind the evolution of children's horror stories, and then kind of go through that history and then talk about why we think those things are important to our lives, children's lives in general, and kind of give you an overview that is a little bit more detailed than what we've done in the past, speaking specifically about something like Goosebumps or Are You Afraid of the Dark? They're going to be part of a bigger whole today.
Hello, weirdos. Hello, creeps. Here I am at Porcelain Peak. Camp is really scary and strange, and they say all the counselors are deranged. I went swimming with a kid named Jason, while some counselors were sucking faces. You remember that girl with Ricky? Turns out she's a dude and showed us her dickie. We tell stories around the fire about killers who won't retire. Most of them all like to wear masks, and they'll slash us if we drink or smoke on some grass. Don't be scared or flip your lids. Killers don't always hurt us kids. Plus we rarely go out alone. We're more scary than each on its own.
So I guess we can go ahead and start with John, because it sounds like you did a little bit of a deep dive into the history of kind of how far this genre goes back, because I would consider it almost sort of its own genre of horror, its own...
Definitely a subgenre.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, so as far as like horror that is geared towards younger audiences, it is something that it's hard to quantify exactly when it started, because horror as a whole existed before print media and before like movies and TV all existed and all that stuff. So, I mean, you can go as far back as saying like around campfires. I mean, that's kind of
probably the earliest we would be able to guess that it would have started would be scary campfire stories. Yeah.
Stories, different things in folklore, cryptids, like those things all existed before real media existed.
And I think that's why we thought this would be something that would fit really nicely into the camp theme too, is that it sounds like it's kind of like all of these extensions, horror books for children, horror movies for kids and stuff, all kind of go back to that same idea of like sitting around and hearing a scary story around a campfire. So,
spoken word.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think you can find elements in early stuff too. So maybe the story itself isn't necessarily horror, like with something like The Odyssey or with Beowulf, but there are these horrific elements to those stories.
Yeah, definitely.
Obviously, those aren't necessarily aimed at children, but we see elements of horror popping up way early.
Yeah, like, I mean, if you look back, there are things that are specifically aimed towards kids that were uncovered by a research paper that was written by someone at Johns Hopkins University, where they kind of broke down like where some of the origins of like horror that's specifically aimed at kids came from. And like they're like even back into like the 1850s, there are stories that were written by people in Germany that use horror as kind of a vehicle to scare kids into
the boy who sucked his thumbs.
Yeah, that scare kids into following the rules. Like there's
Yeah.
always some kind of a moral about using proper etiquette or about following specific things that your parents tell you to do, not talking back, that sort of stuff.
I mean, I think you can even see it in stuff like Little Red Riding Hood in the original story, right? They get eaten and they have to get cut out. Like, that's horrific.
Yeah, and so you go back to these... a lot of people, I think, forget because our modern conception of a lot of these stories is the Disney-fied version.
Yeah.
As much as I love those movies, if you go back to a lot of those stories, a lot of it is like Pinocchio getting his legs burned off or whatever, and in Cinderella, people getting like toes or feet cut off or whatever. Like there's just a Little Mermaid, turning into sea foam and dying at the, there's a lot of scary stuff, and that goes back to like Grimm fairy tales, and a lot of it is just teaching your kid,
fables.
and you can even apply it to something like Santa Claus, where it's like if you're not good, like
You're getting the
Krampus. Yeah, exactly. So obviously these stories to scare kids into being good have been around forever.
Yeah, and I think that that's where origins of this come from, and like actual like print media and things that you can trace, but it's not the same as what you get now. And I think that I have theories as to once you start to get into like the 1900s and actually start to get into like real media, that exists now and that's fully trackable. Exactly when it was released, who it was made by, those sorts of things. I think that there's a difference in what existed then as a lesson being more of like, this is something that's meant for enjoyment. It might have a lesson in it somewhere, but it's more about the way that it's enjoyed and it's made to be ingested as entertainment and not about a moral.
Yeah, and I think that it will end up being important kind of toward when we get to more of the modern conception of horror for children, and some of the problems it runs into is that unless it is some sort of morality tale to make your kids behave, there's a lot of flack that children's horror gets for just being meaningless ways to terrify your kids into having nightmares. And there's a lot to be said about that, but we can continue to move on through the timeline. And when we get around to that, we can talk about things like book bannings and stuff like that.
Well, I think along the lines of what you're saying, it doesn't have to be mutually exclusive, right?
Yeah.
It can have a moral and still be scary. And we'll talk more about courage when we get to that era. But that is something that has a meaning to the stories, basically. But those episodes were scary as fuck.
I would say in The Witch, there is a really good example of what I think, main difference, the turning point was for children's horror, maybe back in the day, would be the kids, the younger siblings, hearing the stuff about the scary witch in the woods, but then using it as a game, like running around and playing and saying, I'm the witch of the woods, and like playing a game and having fun with it, which I feel like is exactly what a lot of kids end up finding in horror, is less, the morality tale part. They maybe get that, but they end up enjoying the feeling of being scared, which I feel like adds a different layer to, especially like this contemporary stuff. You know, what's too far, what's too,
Right. Well, along those lines, too, I think that has to do with desensitization, which
definitely.
we can definitely talk about as we get closer to the more modern stuff, because those kids, maybe they got desensitized, where their parents or the government or whatever thought that witches were this terrifying thing, and then the kids were like, it's whatever, we see witches all the time. Jessica got burned last week.
Yeah.
So a question that I wanted to pose to you guys as we move into the modern era of this, I have a specific thing, it's a show, that I think started this kind of horror for children. And I wanted to see what you guys thought. Like, what do you think was the jumping off point for a more modern take on this idea?
So it's tough to say, because I feel like as you get into the 1900s and you have like people who grew up on watching things like the Universal monster movies and that sort of stuff, and then you start to get into like the 80s, which is where that real big push forward into that modern horror for kids type stuff comes from. I think that's also a territory where you see like people who had grown up on some actual true horror tales, you know, things like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Psycho, you know, some of the really intense, like the thing that we consider to be, you know, trunks of horror in general. They grew up on those things and they got enjoyment out of them, and now they're starting to have kids. So they're like, oh, what's something like that, but that I could show my kids, and it's not going to be, you know, there isn't going to be a naked lady in the shower getting stabbed to death kind of stuff. It's tough to say, because I know that like when my mom was younger, she was subjected to a lot of those movies before she thought that she was ready, and she's terrified of horror movies now because of it. I lucked out that she was just kind of like, at a certain point, she just got kind of laissez-faire about it and was just like, oh yeah, if you feel like you're comfortable watching this, watch it. And that was how I was able to start my journey. You know, I think that when you look at some of these anthology series, I think that's where a lot of it starts from. I think that there are obviously movies that jump into that territory as well, but I think that things like Are You Afraid of the Dark, Tales from the Crypt, I think that those are a lot of the places where people started, because they're smaller and easier to digest. They may not all necessarily be aimed specifically at kids, but they're where a lot of kids get into.
Is your question, though, what do we think the thing that kick-started children's horror is? Like, not necessarily in the 90s or whatever, but are you asking, like, in general, like, how early back do you think?
I mean, so the thing that I'm thinking of, and I can just tell you, is in the 70s, I'm thinking that it really started taking off with Scooby-Doo.
Yeah.
Who watched Scooby-Doo? Did you watch the original Scooby-Doo when you were a kid?
When I was a kid, yeah.
And you did, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And my dad watched it.
And I did, yeah. And it's one of those things where, sure, it's not super scary, but there's ghosts, there's ghouls. And at the end, you know, it's always a person in a mask or whatever. But there's some of those episodes where you don't know that, and they're scary. You know, that scuba diver one where he's like lurking over you. To me, that's, I think, probably my first introduction. And it's way before our time.
Yeah.
And so I'm sure that there's a lot of people before us, like, 20 years before us, grew up on that stuff.
Well, and I would say that the actual inception is probably even earlier in children's literature, which would be like the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew mystery novels, because I know personally that was like step one, because it was just the smallest amount of like intrigue and creepiness. It was always creepy lighthouses. Like the covers always had them investigating dark towers and creepy places, but the stories themselves were never terrifying. It was just there would be a little air of young guys or a young girl in some sort of peril that they're going to solve and get out of. And I would say that Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew probably had a pretty big influence on Scooby-Doo.
Well, I think another one that just came to mind when you said Tales from the Crypt and you have that shirt on is comic books, right?
Yeah,
Wasn't there
definitely.
Was it Eerie Comics? Wasn't that a brand for a while? It was like a branch of DC or something.
Well, you had so many different like tales of suspense, tales of horror, and then obviously all the EC Comics stuff that would come later. Yeah, where they would tell the horror stories, and this was before there was a comics code that kind of destroyed that for everyone for a long time. But yeah, there's spooky comics. I mean, you always see there's a kid like in Creepshow reading scary comics, and the parents are always concerned, and that was to the point that there was a code enforced to regulate what kids could consume in comic books, and it screwed over a lot of companies in the comic book industry. And that's a topic that we could go into, endlessly on a different episode or something. But obviously that gets into what I was foreshadowing, which would be censorship and stuff like that. But yeah, I would say probably Hardy Boys Mysteries, at least for me, and those are the oldest material I can think of outside of the Grimm fairy tales. But I would say like directed at children for their enjoyment, not so much to scare them, I feel like would probably be where that kind of thing starts.
Yeah, and like I said, I think Scooby-Doo is kind of that gateway drug in a way where you get just a taste, kind of like what you were saying. But this is definitely more horrific than something like Nancy Drew, because there are these ghouls and goblins and that kind of thing.
But then the lesson at the end is always that it's not real.
Right.
That it's that humanity is the real monster, which I feel like while that show can be incredibly repetitive, the overall lesson is a good one for kids. And it's
some Aaron Mackey shit.
Well, yeah, and it's and this is Scoob.
Oh my god.
I mean, that show is basically a microcosm of like what the entire defense for children's horror would be, which is to show them the world is scarier than these horror things are, and that ghosts and vampires and ghouls can be fun and can be costumes, but they're not real, and that's debatable. Obviously, people are probably going to be screaming at us on here, being like, "Oh, you cynics" or whatever. But that's the point. I think.
We all admit to being cynical.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'd also throw in the ring the Twilight Zone. I feel like it's an older series for sure. I feel like it is something where everybody sat around and watched, and that is predicated by similar things that people sat around radios and listened to before. I mean, that's definitely a territory that I didn't do enough research into during this, because I thought about things printed and I thought about things in video form. I didn't think about radio. Radio definitely bridges that gap. Things
so
like
strange. It would almost be like we work in an audio medium.
Yeah, true story.
One thing before I think that we go any further, we should shout out in praise of Shadows. The video from YouTube. That's a channel there. He has a video called Horror for Kids, dominated in the 90s. And I watched this years ago when I first thought about this idea, because it's always something that really interested me, probably because we grew up with all of it.
Yeah.
And I shot it to you guys, and you guys really liked it. And you had already been familiar with the channel. So shout out to him and his video. If you're interested on kind of a brief synopsis of all of this, then I would recommend that.
Yeah,
and if you're looking for things that are specifically diving into like specific parts of the media, like specific Goosebumps episodes, or like Are You Afraid of the Dark, like digging into the actual content, Ryan Hollinger is another channel that does a lot of really great work around specifically diving
another one of
into
my
all that as
favorites.
well,
Yeah, love both those channels.
So from there, I would say that we get a little bit more with the 80s. And I think part of the reason that we got this big surge is because all these slashers came out,
I
right?
was going to say the same thing, yeah.
And I feel like it parallels now. We can talk more about it as it comes to it. But you get these movies, and you're a kid, and everyone's talking about Freddy Krueger. So you want to say Freddy Krueger, but it's inappropriate. So what does the media do? They make something that's scary, but appropriate for you to watch. And then we start getting all of these shows in the 90s when we were growing up. And we got Goosebumps, we got Are You Afraid of the Dark, we got Courage the Cowardly Dog. What else?
All Real Monsters.
All Real Monsters, Scary Stories, even the print media too. So we have Goosebumps in that, Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, which I think was banned, right? At some point?
Yeah, so it ended up being a big deal specifically because of the artwork. which is why those books ended up being re-released with new artwork, and then that ended up being a huge shit show, and they had to re-release them again with the original artwork. But yeah, that has become kind of a notorious part of the history of scary stories to tell in the dark, is just the fact that different school districts have tried, pretty much unsuccessfully, since book banning, luckily, is not really a thing in the United States anymore. It was something that really parents thought frightened kids, but any of us, and I feel like anyone you ask about scary stories can tell in the dark, can tell you that they had a lot more fun being scared reading those than they ever had traumatizing nightmares or anything like that. I mean, most people who are fans of those books or Goosebumps or whatever can say, yeah, I was scared, but I wanted to be.
That was what I intended on doing.
Yeah, I went in with that intention. I think that's where things turn around for some people and don't turn around for other people. And that was kind of a disclaimer that I wanted to put out in general, was that we understand horror is not for everyone. So I think that's something important to understand while you're listening to this kind of conversation about children's horror, and also thinking about maybe how you're going to apply that to your own personal life, maybe with kids going forward, is that you never should try to force your kids into these kind of things. But if it starts to happen organically, I think that's good, and we can go more into that in a little bit if you like.
Take some advice from 3 non-parents.
Yeah.
We'll tell you how to raise your kids.
Yeah.
So some of the research that I did involved some of the psychology about it, because we had talked about discussing some of that. So essentially there's 2 kinds of fear, right? There's the short-term, the temporary fear, and then there's this long-term that stays with you, and that's something like anxiety. And as I was doing this research, I was like, oh, okay, so I probably had the short-term, but then it was talking about anxiety, and then that hit the nail on the head. I was like, oh, maybe I do have pretty bad anxiety. So I wonder if it has anything to do with my love and my inception into the horror genre as a kid.
I read that because there are plenty of studies that do argue, and that's something else I also want to do in this conversation, is bring up the counter argument, which is that there are studies that show that a lot of traumatizing horror as a child can lead to sleep problems, which leads to sleep deprivation because of night terrors or nightmares, things like anxiety, depression, which everyone in this room can check most of those boxes off. So that could be a byproduct, but it's something that I don't want to lean too heavily on, because it's stuff like that is so ambiguous, and it really is on a case-by-case basis. But it does make me curious if that is something where, having been willingly or unwillingly exposed to horror material as a child, if that did have an effect on my emotional stability as an adult.
I can tell you for sure that I feel like things like horror actually help to quell some of my issues with anxiety and, with stress and that sort of stuff. I feel like it's a good escape for me. And I felt like that when I was younger, I'm not the kind of person who's easily in the physical response scared territory. So the whole the jump scares, most of those don't get me. I'm pretty iron tight when it comes to that sort of stuff. And some things do, but that's not really an emotional response. I feel like the emotional response stuff typically has a big effect on me, but it also is something that I am able to at least compartmentalize into oh, this is something you should think about more, rather than it being oh, this is the scariest thing ever, you should avoid this like the plague. It's more about sparking a conversation, about being able to bring it back to you guys and have a discussion about it, And even before we started doing this in audio format, and we were just having the discussions as 3 buds, I feel like that's...
If we had started recording our conversations years prior, we would already be on episode 600 or something.
Definitely.
So some of the studies did show that the biggest effect is the temporary effect. Fear of the dark, fear of strangers, that all eventually fade. And so I think that's important to note, that most of the time you're getting these short-term effects, if anything. And a lot of what comes along with watching horror as a kid, and maybe probably now too, is that adrenaline rush.
Dopamine.
You want to get scared, and that's why you go see it. People are always like, oh, why do you watch horror movies? It's I want to get scared. I don't want to go into this movie to be shitty and be cynical and have a bad time. I legit want this movie to scare me.
Yeah.
And we've talked about that on the show where... I haven't been that scared in a while. I think when you watched Hell House, you're like, I haven't been that scared.
To where I felt like I needed to cover my eyes. I haven't done this since I was a kid. Yeah, it's crazy. Kind of going along with that, I pulled some quotes from some of the articles that I read, because I felt like some of the ways that the writers who were defending children's horror, or kind of talking about the benefits, had really well-worded things to say. So rather than butchering them here, I just pulled them and thought they would make good talking points. The first is from a Slash Film article, basically about why horror for kids is good. And it says, kids are anxious and observant, and scary movies give them a safe place to frame that anxiety, to give it a name, and face it through the brave young protagonists fighting monsters or witches or ghosts on screen. And a lot of the stuff that I read talked about how kids are just generally very anxious, because there's a lot in your life as a kid that you can't control. you're basically at the whim, emotionally, financially, everything of your parents. And so horror a lot of the time gives you a sense of kind of control over your anxiety because you're intentionally going in to experience it and knowing there's an endpoint to it and knowing that it's not real.
You're also constantly attempting to grasp an ever-expanding universe. It's something where when you start as a kid, it's all about the immediate. It's all about what's in the room with you, what's in your neighborhood, and that slowly expands out to what's in your town, what's in your county, what's in your state, what's in your country, and goes even further than that. The more that you learn and the more that you know. So I feel like the more that weight is put on your shoulders in a way, the more you grow in that anxiety and the more that you realize like oh, even the little things that I do could have massive effects on society as a whole. And learning that you have to be responsible and that you have to, at some point in time, you'll have to get a job and you'll have to contribute and you'll have to be able to be someone that other people could potentially look up to, or forego all of those things and become a terrible murderer and go to jail. It's a lot of decisions and it's a lot of pressure.
It on a podcast.
Yeah. Like, think about the earliest game that you play as a baby. It would be Peekaboo, which is basically just jump scare the game.
Yeah.
And kids love it. Like, babies laugh and they love it, but because babies don't have object permanence, to them, you literally are, like, disappearing and reappearing in front of them, and that's kind of a horrific idea if you think about it from that perspective. So that's almost, to me, like, a very early sign of the understanding that fear can be fun. Like, being startled can be fun. Yeah. Something else that I saw in here that kind of goes back to the lessons that we can learn from horror. It says movies like Return to Oz, Monster Squad, The Witches, Coraline, Paranorman, Hocus Pocus, Goosebumps, and Halloween Town.
I think I just creamed in my panties.
Yeah. Teach kids how to handle PTSD, loneliness, the loss of loved ones, being a misfit, and fighting with your friends. They encourage bravery and reward strength of character. These movies tell kids to be doers instead of passive observers.
Right. It tells you that you can overcome the monsters. Typically, the monsters don't win. I mean, even with some of the Harry Potter stuff. There's horrific stuff in those movies, but they always show you that you can defeat the fucking darkest wizard this side of the Mississippi, you know what I mean?
And on top of that, it's also being able to put a name to a face. It's something where you can take some of your internal struggles and use things that you learn from watching them externally struggle with monsters, being able to turn those in on your own inner demons.
Yeah, and this obviously doesn't apply to every single to every single bit of horror. Not all of it has some sort of lesson it's trying to teach you, but a lot of children's horror does, and a lot of time it's not as apparent as I feel like parents would like it to be. A lot of time those lessons are just things that kids are picking up like subliminally or subconsciously as they're watching. It's not always right in your face as much as something in a Goosebumps episode might be. Some things like a Coraline might be a little bit more difficult to understand how that ties into like your connection with your family and imposter, a lot of different things that can be scary as kids. You feel those more than you understand them as a kid, but your brain is still processing. That's one of my favorite Mr. Plinkett Red Letter Media things, where it's like, you might not have realized it, but your brain did.
So one thing that I did come across, too, is that studies showed that seeing the wrong movie at the wrong time, it's usually before 12, can scar a person for years. So that is something
AKA my mom.
Right, yeah. And I know that I watched, I have an older brother, and so I think I watched Shocker when I was a kid, which is I think it's a Wes Craven movie.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And stuff like that, where I saw Freddy. And it got to the point where even the music from Tim Burton stuff, that Elfman music, used to scare the shit out of me, dude. And I would associate it with Scissorhands, who I would associate with Freddy Krueger.
Well, and you just burst open a whole other thing that I'm glad you mentioned, which is Tim Burton movies being
like pseudo horror,
mostly geared toward children, and also being influenced by a lot of like German expression and the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and stuff like that. Yeah. So I mean, a lot of that stuff influenced my love of horror, but I can openly say I was a very traumatized, very scared child in general. Most scary things I saw, I was not like, oh yes, give me more. I had nightmare, and I talk about it openly now. I came out the other side as I feel like a stronger person for it, and I love that I can watch horror now with such enjoyment. But I completely understand that it can be very discouraging for maybe somebody trying to show their kids horror and missing the right age range and going too early. And I understand where the fear comes from. Like, it's easy to say, oh, well, parents are just being stuffy about this stuff. And it's like, the last thing you want to do is terrify your kid, unless you're one of those shitty, like, jump scare dads who wants to put your stuff on TikTok, But
Yeah.
you don't want your kids to be afraid. You don't want them to cry. So, but I think the important thing to remember is, like you were saying earlier, a lot of that stuff is temporary. Yes, they may have some nightmares, but nightmares are normal. They're going to have nightmares anyway. If it's better that they're having nightmares about the Crypt Keeper than the nightmares about whatever horrible thing is going on the news. I'd rather have my kids having nightmares about Freddy Krueger, my imaginary kids having nightmares about Freddy Krueger, than having nightmares about the awful, awful things that are going on right now in the real world, having like pandemic nightmares and stuff. Like,
one of the things that used to scare me was, as a kid, was America's Most Wanted.
Yeah.
My parents would watch it after Cops, I think, and that used to scare the
I
fuck
always
out of me
found
because it
that
was
stuff
real.
way scarier than horror movies.
Like, dude, there's a murderer out. You know, at least Kruger's only in my dreams.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, and like it is tough because like I said, I've seen firsthand what happens when someone has showed something too early. Like my mom watched Jaws when I think she was sub 10, and she just recently, the first time that I can think of in recorded memory, stepped foot in an ocean.
Wow.
Yeah, she's the kind of person who's like, I'm gonna sit back all the way back on the beach.
I was 100% in the same boat. I had sworn that I would never go swimming in the ocean.
Was it a bigger
because I still think that the ocean is a bit frightening, but I had to overcome that fear if I was going to enjoy a trip to Hawaii. So I put myself out there and I went snorkeling and stuff, and it was scary at some points. Like I was trying not to trick myself because I saw Jaws when I was very young, and that movie definitely scared me quite a bit.
One thing I will say about the ages, because you were talking about your mom being under 10, you were talking about watching Jaws at a young age. I was mentioning how it's better if they don't do it after or before 12, depending on the movie. But at 5 years old, studies have shown that kids have trouble distinguishing between fantasy and reality. So if we had to put an age range on it, I would say start after 5.
Well, that's a lot of what this article for The Artifice was talking about, which is kind of when kids start to be able to differentiate between fantasy and reality is when you should be able to start showing them horror movies as like a learning experience with them. It just use common sense, obviously, like make sure you're there with them. There are good resources online for finding out what's appropriate for certain age ranges of children. But I did find a quote that I thought was really good that said children should get the opportunity to expand their imagination through challenging themes and concepts, especially horror, as long as it is aimed at their age group. Secondly, children old enough to understand horror as fiction also have the capability to find deeper meaning in these stories, consciously or unconsciously. Though through horror, kids can learn that fear is natural and necessary, and that overcoming it brings a sense of power and control that won't be achieved through overprotecting parenting or censorship. So that
Don't be
basically
helicopter
ties
parents,
up.
show them horror.
Well, I mean, it's basically it ties in everything you just said, which is if your kid can differentiate, then they're at the age where it might be good for them to start learning some of these lessons that could come from different horror movies. But it says, regardless of how parents assert their presence to prevent it, every child will face fear. Researchers believe that children are born with certain instinctive fears, like you were saying, while others are cultivated by social contact. This study said that there are only 2 innate fears, which would be the fear of falling and the fear of loud noises. And it does talk about a lot about how it's very easy to see in a young child how they cannot process mentally how long a threat is going to last. So when they hear a balloon pop, an adult is going to hear that, get startled, and then move on. A kid's going to cover their head and start crying for the next half hour. They don't have that capability to really comprehend what they're seeing and understand what it means. So keep an eye on your kid when you notice that they start to want to have these conversations about bigger topics and other things like that.
And
then
ease them in. There's a wide range of steps if this is something that interests you. And I don't want to turn into a fucking parenting podcast. But
Yeah.
there's definitely steps that you could go to. I wouldn't start off with Nightmare on Elm Street, you know.
I would start off by sitting down with them and reading one of the Goosebumps books. That's a great place to start.
So to kind of move things along a little bit, you know, in the 90s, all this stuff boomed. We had all those shows, all these movies, all this print media, and things were great. This is what we grew up on. This is what we craved. And then things kind of started to slow down. And one thing I read said that they believe that the reason this all started to slow down was because 9/11. And I was like, whoa, I didn't even think about that. That didn't cross my mind. What did cross my mind was a different reason, and I wanted to know if there's any reason why you guys thought that we saw kind of this dissipate in about the early 2000s, late 90s. This kind of started to go away. There was outliers, obviously. I think you mentioned Coraline, Frankenweenie, Paranorman. I mean, apparently, if it's stop motion,
they could still get away with it.
the internet.
You think the internet is why it stopped?
I mean, I think the internet just created a different outlet for some of these things. I mean, I think people have a lot more, like kids have a lot more access to creepy shit online. Like they're able to just watch scary videos or read creepypastas if they want to or whatever, and or play Five Nights at Freddy's. Like kids are a lot more into the digital age of stuff and these little TV shows and books. Books? What's a book?
Yeah.
You know, I feel like that has something to do with it. I'm not saying that's the entire cause, but I would say that the
Right.
timeline matches up well. And I think that kids are probably not sitting around bored half as often and wanting to pick up Goosebumps books or scary stories to tell in the dark.
I have my theory as well. Mine is video games. I feel like
Of course it is, John.
So I feel like video games, they take a section of time that is so much more massive than sitting down and watching 30 minutes of TV or spending 20 or 30 minutes a night reading a book. I feel like a lot of times, it got to a certain point where people would be, instead of, I'm going to go out and buy you a bunch of books, here, I'm going to hand you a Game Boy, here, play Pokemon. Or, here's a PlayStation original. Here, you can play Spyro the Dragon, or you can play Crash Bandicoot, or any of the other plethora of like Nintendo games. Like there's all kinds of stuff that kids end up sinking their time in, but it wasn't as prevalent and it isn't in as many homes until like the N64 PlayStation era. And then once you start to get to that territory, they started to release all those different versions of the Game Boy, and then you started to get into PS2 and all these other things. And there were horror titles that were on those, but those were aimed at adults. Kids still played them because all video games are aimed at kids, but it wasn't like it was like, oh, this is specifically a kid-level horror thing. Like, I remember playing Resident Evil before it was appropriate, and it scaring the shit out of me.
Well, a lot of times parents will buy games, and at least when we were kids, without really knowing what they were.
Yeah.
And if you look at a movie cover, you can pretty much tell what that movie's going to be about. And so I think that makes a lot of sense, is that, well, they had a different outlet, which wasn't as regulated as something like what you're watching.
Yeah.
Well, and you definitely have to take into account that VHS in general was a huge deal for like kids getting their hands on horror. So with VHS phasing out, and I mean VHS specifically, I feel like especially during like big video rental times in the 90s and stuff, that was like a lot of people's introduction to stuff they should not have seen. Because a lot of time your parents would say, hey, maybe we shouldn't rent this. But a lot of time things would slip through the cracks. And I've heard a lot of people talk about, their entire Instagram page is dedicated just to like vintage VHS horror because that's how people grew up seeing this stuff. Now with streaming, there's so much content, specifically content for kids that isn't offensive, that parents are probably going to be much less inclined to just let their kids sit in front of the TV and watch whatever. They'll put it on like the kids' Netflix setting, and then they're never going to see something like even like a Halloween Town or whatever. Probably. I've never been on that section, but...
Well, and I'm sure that studies show if that's better or not, because they're not getting that fear, they're not getting that exposure. So are those people going to grow up okay, or are they going to be scared of stuff later on? So what I think dissolved the horror for kids genre in the late 90s, early 2000s.
Tell us.
And this probably won't be a shock to you guys.
I want to know.
But I think that it was Scream, because after that movie was released, we saw, and I have at least 4 different accounts of kids murdering people and blaming the movie. So when stuff like that happens, it gets put into the media, and then people are like, well, if people are so distraught by horrific stuff for children, then maybe we should back off of it.
Oh, yeah, just like the Slender thing recently.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's an account called The Scream Murders. A 16-year-old and 14-year-old kid killed the 16-year-old's mom. They stabbed her 45 times.
Fuck.
Yeah. Said they were inspired
That's
by
45 too many times.
inspired by the first 2 movies. They killed her because they wanted money to go get a mask and a voice changer so they can go on a killing spree. And that happened in 98. In 92, 2 boys killed their friends after watching the movies. In 2002, a boy killed a girl in France wearing a Ghostface mask, said he wanted to emulate Scream. And then during the Columbine case, they used the opening scene, the cold opening from Scream, to show the negative effects of media. And so to me, that seems like, well, if that's so prevalent and so high in the forefront of people's minds, like this horror and this violence is causing kids to do that kind of stuff, then let's get rid of it. And I feel like that's probably one of the causes of why it went away.
Well, even with slashers in general, I feel like because it's young adults who are often the subjects of those films, I feel like it automatically is inclined that young people will see it, even though that's not what the director or the studios intend. They intend on, I mean, as far as we know, what they say out front of everything is that they don't intend on children to see these things, but that they're meant for adults. But at least for part of the movie, when I was younger, I thought that like Billy and Stu were cool, you know, and it wasn't until until you find out that they're killers or whatever. But like as far as it wasn't until I was full blown an adult until I was like, oh yeah, Randy's my guy though, you know.
Well, I think ratings that they put on movies make sense for a lot of times. You know what I mean? So if you see a rating, it's rated R. Maybe you shouldn't let your 12-year-old watch it.
I don't know. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that, but I feel like that's an entirely side conversation
Yeah.
that will
Case
get
by
us way
case
off on
type
our
stuff.
Yeah, I think I have a lot of problems with the way that movies are rated, specifically horror movies. But something that I was going to say too that I literally just thought of while I was zoning out with you talking about Scream was
Sweet.
no, I was just like thinking about Scream, and then I was just like zoning out thinking about how good that is, and how that probably did contribute at some. I mean, that's was a big part of my childhood, but something I thought of too is like the decline of Halloween. I feel like because people are so afraid now to have their kids go out and do Halloween things, I feel like Halloween has changed a lot in the last 10, 20 years.
It's hard to know because I don't trick or treat. You know what I mean?
Well, I mean,
You can tell when you go out on a Halloween night that there are a lot less kids than when I was a kid. Like, and to me, I feel like it's pushed less, and kids or parents are more hesitant, especially to do like the scarier parts of Halloween. That
Because
to
of
me as a
social
kid,
media.
it was just like watch the scary stuff, sit and watch the marathons. That's part of how I got into it. Was Halloween time, was Halloween marathons and all this stuff that it was like it was all that was on TV. Now I feel like you see a lot less of that, and that could be contributing to fewer kids having that kind of interest or exposure.
Well, and with the birth of the internet, you got the birth of social media, which is where a lot of like the scare tactics come from other, people who are like, oh, I don't like horror. I don't like Halloween. I don't like these things. So I'm going to come up with a bunch of reasons why you shouldn't like it either. Stranger danger, like, oh,
Razor blades in the candy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You can share out all these old things that used to be old wives' tales that only got around by word of mouth. Now you can say those to hundreds of thousands, millions of people on the internet, and more people will read it and be like, oh, I don't think we should do that. Instead, we're going to go out while the sun is still up, and we're going to go to the church parking lot, and we're going to do trunk or treat instead of the real shit. Where when I was younger, if they were taking my sister around for trick or treat, it would be like, oh, you guys want to go to that block over there? Go for it. Just make sure that you're back with us over here at this place at this time. And
kids were out in droves.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
it was like one after the other. Like, get the fuck off the porch because I want my Snickers bar.
yeah.
Yeah. So,
Yeah,
I mean, it's very different, and I just feel like times have changed and parents are a lot more worried about their kids. I mean, that's why people want to tell children stories in the 80s these days, is because kids were free to go out on their bikes and do whatever they wanted until it got dark. Like, it was a different time for sure.
It's harder to tell a story when you have all of the requirements of 2020 life.
Yeah, it's crazy, especially now. So one of the last things I want to say that I feel like has been an especially important part for me and was very impactful to like my evolution with horror is that was the article about the father on the New York Times talking about showing his 7-year-old daughter Jaws, which is probably close to around the age. I think I was in 3rd grade, so probably like 7 or 8 years old. It says, during the movie and afterwards, she pointed out how the music manipulated her and wondered aloud why the shark attack scared her less than the dead body discovered underwater. At its best, horror invites engagement in a way that other genres do not. Watching Jaws was disturbing for my daughter, but also made her more alert to its director's artistic choices and prompted her to think harder about what disturbed her. The Blair Witch Project didn't just terrify her, it inspired her to make her own movie. And
That seems like best case scenario.
yeah, no, it absolutely is. Now he goes on to talk about how now he's shown her Alien and things like that. But I do think that horror is a very good gateway to a lot of just critical thinking a lot of the time.
Like what we deal with every time we're here in the room, good discussions. Like, I mean,
Oh, totally.
I mean, I would need more fingers and toes than exist in California to count all of the conversations that I've had that have been really great discussions that have started based on something scary or something horror in general.
Start collecting those toes, John.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there could be also a lot of good social commentary built into it, too. So, and we can talk a little bit more about that later, but we start to see, after it kind of dies down, some outliers. There's episodes of certain shows that are spooky. Even like Hey Arnold has some spooky stuff. Adventure Time has some spooky stuff. And then we get movies, like you said, with Paranorman, and Frankenweenie is another great example.
Yeah, and then Coraline and Neil Gaiman in general, like he's been a
Right.
big voice for a lot of young horror fans, writing things like The Graveyard Book, and which I think you might have given me at some point, or I know.
I don't know.
I mean, but Neil Gaiman wasn't someone that I discovered till I was an adult. But I mean,
Right.
I think he's right in line with like the R.L. Steins and the Schultzes of the world doing those spooky things for kids. But yeah, I think that there have been some outliers, and it seems we're always hoping that it's going to make some sort of resurgence. I think before any of us have kids, we would if we ever have kids, it would be nice if there was there's a lot of good material out there, but.
Well, I think it is coming back.
Yeah, and that's where I think I wanted to kind of bring this discussion to an endpoint would be let's talk about how we feel it is currently, what are some highlights, and then kind of just how we feel personally about the state of things right now, and as horror fans who are still young and can still pretty vividly remember our childhood experience with horror, kind of how we feel about the subject in general.
So we talked about Are You Afraid of the Dark coming back, and so it is happening. And then we got the Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark movie, which I think was PG-13, but pretty accessible. And we're supposed to be getting a second one of that. We've had these Goosebumps movies, although a little bit goofier. They still have some horrific elements to them.
And speaking of Jack Black and horror,
You're talking about House of the Clock
and its Walls. I started watching it today just out of curiosity because it was popping up in some of these articles about children's horror. I was enjoying what I was seeing. I mean, it wasn't anything that was blowing me out of the water, but I felt like as a kid, it
Probably
was
the best thing that Eli Roth has ever made.
I mean, it's Eli Roth, which is it's Eli Roth making a children's horror movie. So I was like, I should check this out. And it's charming. It's Jack Black. So it's nothing terrifying, but it's probably something I would have been really into as a kid. It feels like it fits right in line with like the Goosebumps stuff. And that's nice to see. These things just outside of maybe like a Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark don't do terribly well, it seems like. I don't know. You can think like a Monster House. Did Monster House do well? I remember that was.
I don't know, but I can.
great.
The thing that I can think of that has the most horror elements and has been the most successful is Stranger Things. Stranger Things, because it was able to encapsulate kind of that 80s vibe, and because it has those scary elements to it. Like, I mean, the very first scene is something straight out of a fucking horror movie. I mean, just the running away, through the laboratory and being attacked at the end of the hallway in the elevator. That shit's fucking terrifying. Like, it is a very well crafted scene, and I feel like that's part of the reason why it's on the resurgence is because 80s and 90s culture is circling back in the zeitgeist. People are like looking back on the 80s fondly and wanting to go back to times that were like that. So things that were popular in that time are also making a comeback.
And I think that's a huge point that kind of runs through this entire discussion is just how much nostalgia has an influence on what you love as an adult. If you are nostalgic for very strong experiences with horror that really you feel like shaped your life, not everybody's going to be in that same boat. Some people are going to be like horror or whatever. Some people just don't like it because it doesn't tickle that part of their brain. But for people like us, like it's nostalgia. And for parents especially, seeing something like Stranger Things, if you grew up in the 80s, you're probably like, well, I can't let my kids do stuff like that now, but I can at least show them what it used to be like show them what used to freak us out when we were kids.
Some of my best experiences in my entire life have dealt with horror media in general, and I feel like if I were...
Are we part of that experience, John?
Definitely. If I were in if I were in the market to have a child, I would say that...
Can't say that, John.
I would definitely say that I would want to try to pass those experiences down as something like, hey, like when it's appropriate, this is something that I'd like to show you as an experience and maybe experience together, in the appropriate ways in order to help them foster those discussions with their friends as they get older and, see if it's something that tickles their fancy as well.
Yeah.
I think that you guys make really good points with the nostalgia, especially with Stranger Things, and then Stranger Things made other movies happen, like that movie Summer of '84, and then It, where you get to see these kids, and kids see kids in these movies, and then want to see these movies.
Yeah,
so
and
it's scary for them probably. Like if you were a kid now and watched It, it's probably going to scare you, but they want to see it because there are children in it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and for me, I'm glad that you brought Stranger Things up because when the last season was airing, my dad and I were having conversations because my dad was in his 20s in the 80s, and I'm in my 20s now, and we were both enjoying the show, and he was able to actually talk about the things that were happening like I remember, and he was getting excited about them, and I was like, I don't remember those things, but like there are other parts of the show, like just the nostalgic feeling like gets to me. But it's really neat that it can be a bonding thing, which is the other big thing that I wanted to land on at the end, is that I feel like horror and science fiction, but I feel like especially horror, it just is really good for community building. It's a really easy way to learn who your friends are. Like if somebody's into horror, a lot of the time, yeah.
It's basically why we're here.
And for the most part, every person that I've talked to on the social media who has been into horror has been a delight to talk to. And for the most part, they're very, very nice and accepting people. And I think a lot of that comes from why we end up being into horror as adults in the first place, would be whatever kind of potentially traumatic experiences we had as children. You know, whether those were real or fictional, you know, those things as adults bring us together when we can all connect through a safe medium like horror. And I don't think that would exist for me if it hadn't been a huge part of my childhood. And that's what I hope for other kids. And so I'm really excited to see things like you said, like Are You Afraid of the Dark and Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark and
all the
Goosebumps movies. Yeah. Coming back and we're supposed to be getting in the future. We've talked about it on news, some more R.L. Stein stuff in terms of anthology shows and things. So
the only other thing that I could think of is why it's coming back is because, and you can agree or disagree with this, but I feel like horror, the big genre itself, is sort of in this renaissance, right? Where we're getting all this basically A24 stuff and Blumhouse stuff that is this elevated horror.
But at the same time, you're getting things like The Last Drive-In with Joe Bob that are all dedicated to the hype around cult classic. And, you know, I'm going to be talking a little bit more in my watch list about that kind of stuff. But I feel like there's a lot more respect coming toward the schlockier stuff, like the more fun, crazier stuff. It's not all like, oh, if it's highbrow, then horror's important.
Right.
But in terms of...
But we're in this renaissance.
Yeah,
right?
exactly,
I mean, a Blumhouse movie comes out, once a month or something.
I mean, the
like
fact that we have a horror streaming service like Shudder, I think, is a big deal.
And so I think that that's part of it, too. It's a lot more accessible. The genre is, in itself, coming back. And I think that kind of has to do with some of the 90s stuff, too, where we saw this flush of slashers in the 80s, and then you got horror for kids.
Well, yeah.
And now we're seeing this resurgence of this elevated stuff or some of this silly slasher stuff, and now we're getting more horror for kids. Like, it just is what's happening.
Yeah, it's a trickle-down effect almost.
Yeah, and with the 80s having made a resurgence, everybody's expecting, like, you know, that the 90s could potentially do the same thing, and all of the great children's horror from the 90s could get reboots and reimaginings, and I'm very excited for that stuff to happen.
That's all I really had to say. Is there anything else that you guys wanted to add?
And the last thing that I wanted to end on was just that I feel like the community around this is having horror is something to talk about as a big part of my life. I feel like it's a great way to connect with people, but I think it's an even better way to connect with yourself. So, you know, if you're looking to learn a life lesson about who you are as a person, horror is a great way to do that if you are of the right mind.
Yeah, and then I just wanted to end on a quote from Schultz, the author of the Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark books. This was his quote directed at children. He said, "All of these stories, and there are scads of them, are really saying, watch out. The world's a dangerous place. You're going out on your own soon. Be careful."
Yeah.
And I think that is where the importance of horror for children really lies, is that it really just, I feel like, prepares you for life. And that's how a lot of these authors feel about it. You see countless quotes from the Steins and the Gaimans and the Schultzes of the world all saying, you know, it's inoculation.
Yeah.
So I'm really glad that we got around to having this discussion, though, because it's something that we could probably go on for a much longer time. And who knows, maybe with more developments in the future, we can go, you know, on some other
round two.
Do a round 2 in the future or something, and kind of go into more of the history of things like radio, like you were saying, you know, and talk about stuff like that for sure.
Yes, and if there's anything that you guys think that we missed or shows from those eras that you want to talk about, then shoot us a line on an email or in a comment or on any of our socials. We'd love to hear from you. And this is a huge topic, especially for people of our age that are into the genre. I mean, a lot of you listening probably grew up with most, if not all, of the stuff that we mentioned today.
And more.
Yeah.
Yeah, especially a time like this, I feel like community is very important.
Yeah, and that's why I really wanted to emphasize thanking the Instagram community and the Twitter community, because it's been so nice to know that even though we're all locked in, there's still all these people that we could talk to that have the same feelings and are going through the same shit and who want to get spooked.
Yeah,
nonstop.
absolutely.
And I know it's hard to say that an escape of from any of these things that are going on, with the pandemic and with all the other terrible things that are taking place that the world is trying to self-correct, basically. That we provide even a modicum of escape for those people, if it's just you scrolling across something on our Instagram, or if you check out the trivia videos, or if you're listening to this episode right now. Like I said, it's something that we definitely appreciate, and we're glad we can be here for that, to at least try to bring some civil discussion and levity to your life.
So in typical children's horror fashion, we gave you some children's horror, and we ended with a positive message. Let's move into that fucking watch list.
Look what I did. I packed you and your cousin some goodies for the ride up to camp. Wasn't that nice of me?
Any chips?
Why, of course. I believe there's a whole bag.
I got two things on the docket. I'll throw them out. There is a show on Netflix called Creeped Out. That is a show for young teens, preteens probably, that is a horror anthology. So each episode's different. Yeah, that's been on there, I think, since the last Halloween. They'll probably have a season 2 coming soon, so I would recommend that if this idea is something that interests you. The other thing that I want to recommend is called Delivery. That is one of the Hulu Into the Dark movies. Okay. That was from May. That was the Mother's Day episode, or I guess episode. They call them episodes, but they're movies.
Yeah.
Anyway, it has some Misery vibes.
Ooh.
Yeah, and it's pretty good and pretty graphic. I was watching it with my partner, and she got up and left because it was gross. Yeah, and I don't know. It's pretty good. I would check.
Not awesome that she got grossed out, but awesome that it had the propensity to gross out.
You said that was called Delivery?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so for me, as you all probably already know, there is no room for anything else. There is only Mr. Robot at this moment in time. So Mr. Robot is week 2 going on as my watch list.
Week 2, season 2.
Yeah, see, exactly. So we'll say week 1, I recommend season 1. Week 2, I am currently recommending season 2. I have, I think, 2 episodes left of that one. And then hopefully, as long as I don't have a whole lot going on in the next couple of days, I'll be able to slash my way through 3 at minimum. Hopefully get all the way finished with it, so that way I can watch some other things. But I don't have enough room or bandwidth in my brain to accept anything else at this moment in time. It is only Mr. Robot.
Don't hate to say it, John, but we told you so.
Yeah. I've really been enjoying your reaction texts to everything that's been going on. It's
is that part of your watch list? Is just watching me just send you what the fuck in as many possible ways?
It's just always fun because it'll just be a random point in the day and nothing exciting happening for me, but I'm putting myself in your shoes and having my mind blown, back in that when I found out certain things about that show.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm really excited for you. My watch list consists of a television show as well. This is a show that I started back when it first premiered. I got 2 episodes in and completely fell off. It is a foreign show on Netflix called Dark. Have you guys checked this out?
I have heard of it. I don't know anything else about it.
It's a German language show, very popular critically and on Netflix. Its 2nd season came out last year. Its 3rd season is premiering on the 27th of this month. So depending on when this comes out, it's probably already out. But yeah, this show is amazing. I don't know what tripped me up. I think maybe, like most really good shows, takes a couple episodes to really get in. But it's very moody, very gorgeously shot in Germany, around Berlin. It has the option to do voiceover with English actors. I would not recommend it. Having subtitles, 1, helps you appreciate the performances of those German actors because they are all very great, and 2, forces you to pay attention, which you have to do with this show because it has basically been compared to Stranger Things meets Twin Peaks. It is...
Fucking sign me up.
It's basically...
You make me go Tool Man right now.
666 to midnight.
I would say in a very, very basic sense, Dark is like the adult version of Stranger Things. It's not meant for kids. And I am absolutely loving it. It is so crazy, and every episode has me sitting on the edge of my seat, similarly to Mr. Robot, where the way it's constructed, I was so into it that 4 episodes in, got my girlfriend to start watching with me, and we are currently powering through season 2 together so that we can watch season 3 at the premiere. But yeah, it's gorgeous, super well acted. I highly, highly recommend it if you are a sci-fi or horror fan, which hopefully if you're listening to this, you are both.
As 11 would say, bitchin'.
Yeah, definitely give it a couple episodes, especially since it's foreign. It might take a little bit for your brain to kind of get into the mode that the show is running on. But
basically, Anthony's saying you're dumb.
No, I'm saying I was dumb the first time I tried to watch it.
This is a fucked up camp.
Yeah. And then the other thing that I wanted to recommend just generally is I have been watching a lot of Last Drive-In with Joe Bob. I'm not going to go into every movie that I've watched. I checked out Mayhem and I think Chopping Mall.
Is Mayhem the office building?
Yeah.
Everyone's all
the one that
up?
everybody that came out around the same time as the Belko Experiment.
Is it
Stephen Yun
yeah, Stephen
and
Yun.
Samara Weaving. Twitter was blowing up about it. Twitter gets very excited about Joe Bob Briggs in the horror community. So I checked it out. Didn't like Mayhem that much, but I thought Chopping Mall was really fun. So that's all I'm going to say about that is there's a lot of really good like cult horror to check out with that. And the last thing I wanted to recommend specifically for people who are fans of Friday the 13th and listen to our last episode and want a new Friday the 13th thing to watch, we should watch this like immediately after recording. If you haven't seen it, there is a fan film on YouTube called Never Hike Alone.
I've seen it.
You've seen it?
Yeah.
I have not seen it. Never even heard of it.
It is a very well-made kind of hybrid found footage, modern-day take on a hiker going out and basically discovering Camp Crystal Lake. This thing was completely like Indiegogo. It was very similar to like what Nick did with his Star Wars thing, which is they tried to film it, couldn't really get it off the ground, came back like a year later, and were able to bring a lot more people on board. If you're a fan of specifically Jason Lives, there's a really nice surprise in this fan film that blew my effing mind. And there's a really good like half hour behind the scenes that goes along with that on YouTube. So I would highly recommend it. I personally thought that it was probably on the higher end of like Friday the 13th properties, even though it's not considered canon. So it's about 50 minutes long. So yeah, check that out on YouTube. That's all I got for you guys this week on Watchlist.
That's going to wrap it up this week for our episode. Tune in next week when we are going to bring you some famous scary camp stories. John, hit us with that Are You Afraid of the Dark jingle. Close enough. All right, guys. Thank you for checking this episode out. As always, I have been Counselor Tone.
I've been Counselor John.
And I've been Anthony. Internet darling and camp stud forever.
There it is. There it is. And remember that movies don't create psychos. Movies make psychos
More creative.
Thanks for listening.
Keep it campy. You can find Porcelain Peak on Apple Podcasts, Google Play Store, Spotify, TuneIn, and Stitcher. Wherever you listen, don't forget to rate, review, share, and subscribe so you never miss a spine-tingling episode. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and at porcelainpeak.com for additional content. Special thanks to Randy Greer for composing the Porcelain Peak intro music and to Anthony Silva for designing the Porcelain Peak logo. All episodes and additional content is hosted, written, produced, designed, and edited by the Porcelain Peak team, consisting of Anthony Perez, John Brasher, and Anthony Silva.
This has been here words for awareness production.